Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. Today we're looking at the construction sector on the continent. Now, just looking out the window from the CNBC Africa Sandton studios, there's construction going on all around us. And according to PwC reports on infrastructure, Nigeria and South Africa account for 68% of all the spending on infrastructure development in the region. With a population of over 170 million people, Nigeria and indeed Sub-Saharan Africa as a region still yearn for more infrastructure. The construction industry has a major role to play in satisfying the infrastructure needs of the people. Let's take a look at this report filed by CNBC Africa's Nkenchi Ogbonna in Lagos.
PwC Capital Projects and Infrastructure report says spending on infrastructure in Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa will reach a whopping $180 billion every year by 2025. This is up from $70 billion in 2014. As the region strides in economic development, Nigeria and South Africa are the biggest spenders, accounting for 68% of all the infrastructure spending in the region. The construction industry takes the major slice of the pie in infrastructural development in any society, as it encompasses major sectors such as mining, drilling, soil and water, and a lot more. Due to the growth in urbanization and the tremendous increase in the Nigerian population, basic infrastructural development is a necessity for Africa's largest economy.
The affordable and efficient and productive means of installing fiber optics, of installing cables, pipes, infrastructure generally, with minimal impact on the environment. Rather than open cutting with picks and shovels and breakers, we use trenching equipment which cuts very neat, compact, small trenches very quickly and fast. And where necessary, where you can't do the open cut, then we have the trenchless technologies, horizontal directional drilling for installing under roads and pavements and buildings and rivers without disrupting the surface.
And as a mega brand in Nigeria and as a part of our own strategy to contribute to the development of construction industry, we have brought a high-end heavy industry to Nigeria.
Generally, this replaces drill and blasting, and as we know, with many political factors and insurgents and things like that, the logistics of moving explosives around is becoming more and more problematic. So this really replaces the need for drill and blast, so it replaces the need for explosives.
This year, before election, we face a downtime, but we hope that after inauguration, things will pick up, because there's going to be explosive infrastructure going on across the country.
The power sector also plays a large role in infrastructure development. In most cases, power is the engine room of any thriving economy. Experts say Nigeria's epileptic power supply is a major challenge in production and the affordability of goods and services.
You know, there is always challenges, you know, but also as a part of our strategy, you know, we always look for new ideas, for solutions, you know, to contribute to the development in this sectors, the power, construction and engineering industry.
With the new regime, we have high hope that a lot of things is going to happen. Most of the projects, they are waiting for mobilization to move to site, and it needs money from the government. So that's why some of them are pending.
Surveys reveal low investment in the construction sector, low involvement of private sector in the provision of infrastructure facilities, policy inefficiencies in promoting indigenous contractors, and monumental corruption, among others, are some of the major hurdles hindering basic infrastructure development in Nigeria. However, opportunities abound in Nigeria for investment and infrastructural development.
And joining us now to discuss the role of the construction sector on the continent, as well as the opportunities for investment, I have with me in Johannesburg Richard Matchett. He's a Divisional Director of Development, Transportation and Infrastructure in Africa at WSP Parsons Brickenhoff Africa. Also Wessel van Zyl, he's the CEO of ESO. He's also here in Johannesburg. And from Nairobi, we're joined by Andrew Mandere. Andrew is the chairman of the Kenya Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Gentlemen, thank you for making the time to join us. Wessel, let's get a sense from you as an industry player of the lie of the land on the ground. We're seeing all of these cranes booming all over Sandton, but is this an accurate reflection to say, based on what we're seeing here, infrastructure development is booming on the continent?
Yeah, I think it's quite localized. You're quite right. You know, when you go to Cape Town, Sandton, you know, you'll find lots of cranes, as you say. Unfortunately, the capacity that was created in construction, but maybe particularly because of the World Cup in the 2010 and international players, Europe, the construction industry quite down in Europe, everybody moving into Africa. So what you do find is there's an overcapacity. So although there is, in our view, there's quite a number of projects and viable projects, the problem is that there's also lots more competition and lots more competitors than there used to be. So, you know, so there's still an overcapacity. So we would like to see more cranes, and particularly in Durban and Bloemfontein.
So, Richard, Wessel wants to move away from the localization that we're seeing in Sandton and maybe in Cape Town, in the economic hubs, and saying let's spread the opportunities a little bit. What's your view of the current landscape of the construction sector? And maybe give us a sense of the pulse of the sector and the status on the health of the sector overall.
The work is huge, the work is enormous,
Yeah.
And I think that there's enough to do. The challenge that we face continuously in the sector is a mismatch between the enabling of projects and the need for projects. I think I totally agree with Wessel, there is enough capacity to implement. In fact, I agree with you, there's an overcapacity there. We have contractors, consulting firms, downscaling in some cases because there isn't enough project demand to keep everybody busy, basically. I attribute that largely to a lot of institutional challenges in overcomplicated tendering procedures and in many cases long delays in bringing a project from a tender to groundbreaking.
So let's take the South African view and let's juxtaposition it against what we might be seeing in Kenya. And Andrew, let's bring you into the conversation and get your perception at this moment of the construction sector in Kenya. We've heard in South Africa that we're potentially looking at an overcapacity issue and we're potentially looking at a gap between the available projects and actually bringing them to bankability. Tell us what's happening in Kenya from your point of view.
It's actually very, very, very active. There's a lot of construction going on in almost every sector, most importantly in infrastructural development, in the roads, in the ICT, telecommunication connections, dams, and even in shopping malls. There's plenty of activity going on at the moment.
And Andrew, the drivers of that positive growth that we're seeing in that particular sector, are those drivers specific to the Kenyan economy?
No, I don't think so, because I think most of the government is the main driver in the construction of infrastructure, but there's a lot of direct foreign investment coming in from international community and also from even African community. So you may not say that it's unique to Kenya, because most of the investors even are coming from the Far East, like in China. They are bringing in a lot of resources that are actually driving the construction industry at the moment. And I think they are doing the same thing all over Africa. So I don't think it's unique to Kenya.
So let's take that point, Andrew, and let's throw it back, and I want to bring it back to you, Wessel, and let's talk about where the money is coming from. We're hearing from Andrew that there might be a number of players that have interest in the sector. Where's the biggest fund and the biggest financial muscle coming from pumping into the South African construction sector?
Yeah, we find, call it still from the American side of it, Millennium Funding, USAID, there's still quite a number of aid projects happening in Africa. And I think as Richard has said, you know, those take long before they come to the market. So you have to have a good 3 to 4 year lead time before those projects come to the market. There's also a number of projects, particularly Zimbabwe and Zambia, that we're looking at. We're quite keen on closer to South Africa to keep our base close. And there we also find that the Chinese and Indians are bringing money to the market. But when an investor brings money to the market, he also brings a contractor to the market. You know? So that does put us on the back foot. From the South African side, we are talking to DBSAs, we are talking to some sponsors, investment funds, and we're trying to put together, not particularly PPPs, but we're trying to put a turnkey project together for design and construct. But yes, you have to take money into Africa, and I think Andrew is quite right. You know, the investors comes from maybe the Middle East as well, but they bring money and normally a contractor.
You raised a couple of very important points, and I think we'll take them piece by piece. And Richard, I want to bring maybe the first one, and let's just talk a little bit about about development finance institutions coming to the party and funding infrastructure on the continent. Are we finding that they are effective in bridging that funding gap that might exist in terms of getting the continental ambitions for infrastructure off the ground?
I think certainly. I mean, all the sources of funding contribute towards getting the job done. The biggest challenges that they face is security of their investments. It's one thing to pour a lot of money into the continent expecting a return. The other one is having the certainty that that return will be realized as well. I think that at the moment we're in this chicken and an egg phase where Africa desperately needs infrastructure to enable its economy to grow, and this is a recurring theme. One of the places that the money is going to come from is with the sovereign wealth that comes from natural resources. So as the gas and the oil fields start getting unlocked, a lot of that cash starts coming to the market to enable the development of infrastructure, etc. But we know which comes first. So the gap that you're talking about, where we don't yet have a comprehensive road network, we don't yet have the rail systems to be able to move things around, that aid is vital for that purpose. And then with a long-term view to paying it back once the industry, the industrialization and the natural resources start yielding the returns that they're supposed to.
So on that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, let's pick up on a point that Wessel made, and this is of course with foreign investors coming in with their own contractors and whether this is muscling out some of the local players that we see in the construction sector across the continent. Let's see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us on Invest Africa. And still with me here in Johannesburg is Richard Matchett, the Divisional Director of Development, Transportation and Infrastructure in Africa at WSP Parsons Brinckerhoff Africa. Wessel van Zyl, the CEO of ESOL, also here in Johannesburg. And from Nairobi, we're still joined by Andrew Mandera. He is the Chairman of the Kenya Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Let's kick off this second half of the show by starting off in Nairobi. And Andrew, I'd like you to pick up on a point that Wessel had made before we went to break, and this is with international investment or foreign investment into the sector often comes contractors aligned with that investment. Is this muscling out the local players on the ground, or are we finding that Kenyan companies or broadly African companies are also participants in the sector?
They are active, but the local African contractors, I think they are almost being sidelined on big projects. So it's like they are taking the remnants. The big multinationals, especially now from China, they are taking the bigger infrastructural projects, especially on roads and dams and bridges and so on. And even the European companies which used to do major works in Kenya and East Africa generally, is somehow they don't seem to be competing against the Chinese companies that are actually almost sweeping all the big projects. for some reason or other, they are able to bid much lower than our local contractors and even the European contractors.
Andrew, I think that's an important point to allow our Johannesburg guests to pick up on. Richard, let me throw it to you first. I see you nodding as Andrew is going through that analysis. Your response to that?
Large infrastructure projects obviously need to be run on an international playing field. And I think the challenge that we're starting to see happening, a particular example in Lesotho at the moment, looking at the next phase of the Highlands Development Scheme, the requirements for tendering for consulting firms are set at international standards. And the intention is to bring a lot of local content to the table as part of the teams. But everybody is experiencing a challenge in finding the engineers that are sort of from the local stock of engineers with the appropriate qualifications and appropriate experiences. And so I think all over Africa we're finding that Africa is catching up fast in terms of the qualifications. The universities are starting to push out more and more graduates. But when it comes to the accreditation of those institutions, when it comes to the recognition of the qualifications, there's a challenge, and there's a gap that I believe is starting to close. But until it's properly closed, there's always going to be a struggle for the African participants to match up to, call it the grade,
right.
In terms of what the clients want.
What would your reaction be to that, Vessel? Is it a skills shortage problem that is sidelining the local players, or is there a plethora of reasons that we should be looking at?
Yeah, and Richard is quite correct. You know, we find as well that the tendering conditions to pre-qualify for a project, which traditionally, let's call it in South Africa or Botswana, the South African contractors would traditionally qualify for a similar project somewhere else in Africa. The entry point, or just the, you know, you have to have 5 of these at a certain level, where the South African contractors might have 2 of those at a certain level. So those are the skills. I think South African contractors are very competent. Compared to the industry and the rest of the world, we are right up there. We don't need to stand back for everybody else. Yes, major projects, when we're talking multi-billion dollars, you know, then unfortunately the South African industry is small and there's a number of big players, but you then have to work together.
What about partnering? Is there scope for real partnerships between the handful of the big giants that we find in the sector and the local players who might not be able to stand on their own for a multi-billion-dollar deal, but can certainly contribute at a subcontracting level?
Yeah, I think the Lesotho projects, most of the dam projects, you know, we have no choice in South Africa but to partner. So you'll find in many of the bigger projects, 3 of the big companies, 3 of the big 5 that will have to partner. And when there's a water scheme and a dam project, you will find that, yeah, so it's a general, it's common to JV. You unfortunately can't talk to each other, so it makes it difficult when you JV.
Yeah.
But yeah, a JV is quite a natural way to.
So I want to go back to Andrew, because I think another theme that's coming out from the conversation is these multilateral projects that involve more than one country. And Andrew, what I want to get from you is an understanding whether there's been an alignment between national and regional policies that allow construction deals and construction projects to actually hit the ground running, because there isn't a confusion about what needs to be achieved as per the government versus as per the region.
You know, depending on the size of the project, some projects are international. They are procured through international bidding. And when that's floated out as an international bid, anybody is allowed to bid. And the best offer is the one that carries the day. The government policy is to try and transfer technology. But mainly that technology is transferred through engineers who work on the projects. While they are working for the company that has won the tender, then they are able to learn and study these foreigners so that they can learn the technology through that participation. But the policy is that a local company will have some advantage if they bid up to a reasonable whatever. But even if they are given that advantage in the form of like affirmative action, they don't normally actually win these things because one, the lack of capital, sufficient capital to have the required machinery and resources to carry out these projects, and the technology, you know, is still quite low among the local Kenyans. So in spite of whatever policies that they are in place, still the multinationals, the big companies still have an advantage, and they end up getting most of this.
Andrew, let me pick up on that point, and I want to throw it at Wessel. From what I'm hearing from that analysis, it almost sounds like local companies don't have a fighting chance, and that there's this, and excuse the pun that's coming, that it's stuck in cement, that this is the way it's going to work from here on. Give me a sense of how do we break the barriers so we have more local companies participating in big construction deals?
Yeah, I think maybe Andrew is half right. You know, I think when we talk major construction deals, if we go back to the World Cup, South Africa, which is largely focusing on South Africa, there were a number of projects. We were building 2 airports, we were extending another airport, we were building 4 or 5 stadiums, we were doing a whole road infrastructure network. And I can, you know, off the top of my head, I can think of 1 or 2 of the international players that actually participated in that. You know, so yeah, in a way it's right, but when you're talking multi-billion-dollar, and that's when the working capital comes in, because the conditions normally on a contract is there's a retention that the client holds on the contractor, and let's call it 10%, which means you need to make 10% profit or 12% profit to have 2% working capital. So you actually have to put your own money into it. And that's when a multi-billion-dollar, and you're competing in rands, then it becomes complex to compete.
So you've raised another important point, which is the lifeblood of the sector. And Richard, I want your comment on this. The cash flow issue that we often see killing many of the much smaller construction companies in the South African landscape. To what extent is government also responsible?
The government holds the purse strings ultimately, and their administrative processes will govern the release of payments. There's also a role to play for the supervising professional team in making sure that those approvals, etc., are done timeously. But I believe that that's seldom the cause of issues. Largely, the cash flow issues that I've come across that endanger the small contractors is when either projects get shelved or discontinued, when there's a political decision that changes the allocation of funds, or when a project is initiated but then starts working before there's actually financial close as well. So I think those are some of the big risks. Other typical scenarios are where a municipality or a client actually runs out of funds because the planning was done incorrectly, or a late priority came onto the books.
So are we dealing with a problem that's based on the inability to cost effectively, or are we dealing with mismanagement of funds at a government level? Where does the problem lie?
It's a bit of both, really. It all comes down to planning and management of those funds. And allocating the correct amounts in the right budgets.
And as I wrap up this, I want to bring you in, Wessel, once more to get a response to what Richard's saying, because I did see you nodding there. But also as a company that has felt some of the pressure in the market, you've restructured so that you can continue to be an agile player going forward. Give us a sense of what's next for ESO, but maybe let's start off with Richard's comment first.
Yeah, I think budgets, government budgets, you know, what you see is a trend that, you know, come the end of a budget cycle, you know, there might be money left in the budget and they would like to spend, but then the approval for the next 3 months, you know, to get the new budget into place. And he's also quite right, you know, when there's an under budget, there's inevitably a change in conditions, you know, it's the nature of the beast, you know, contracting is you have to think on your feet, and when something changes, you have to fix it. And then inevitably there's variations to it, and to get those variations, claims, let's call it claims approved, you know, when you're talking the mega projects, the Escoms of the world, you know, it's in everybody's annual report, there's issues about claims and payment of those claims and settling of those claims, which then takes your whole profit margin, you know, it takes the profit into your cash flow, and you don't have cash to operate. So to compete, and it comes back to your point earlier, to compete in bigger projects, you have to have a war chest of money. You know, smaller projects, you can turn around quicker, you can turn the money and you can get your retention and things back, but longer term projects, ties up working capital, so you have to have a long history. ESO, your question coming back to ESO, what is ESO going to do? I think the construction industry in South Africa, mainly ESO, but the others as well, are focusing on what they do well. You know, so I think everybody is restructuring their civils or their infrastructure, or there's certain businesses that they don't do well. You know, you restructure that. What you do well, and there's a lot of opportunities, particularly for us on pipelines and pipe maintenance and pipe jacking, technology that was earlier discussed. On those areas, you then go back to your niche, go back to basics, go and make your money on what you do well, become a little bit smaller, and then get yourself ready to grow if the opportunity comes.
Well, on that point, on sticking to what you know and doing it well and building that war chest of money to compete in the market, let's wrap this show. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. A big thank you to my guests as well. That's Richard Matchett. He's the Divisional Director of Development, Transportation and Infrastructure in Africa at WSP Parsons Brinckerhoff Africa. Wessel van Zyl, the CEO of ESO, who's joined us and also given us some insight as to what next for ESO from here on, and bring us some very robust insights from Nairobi's Andrew Mandere. He is the chairman of the Kenya Institute of Quantity Surveyors. From myself and the team, it's goodbye for now.